There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from managing people, and Cy Wakeman has spent more than 2 decades trying to name its source. In No Ego, she does, and the answer is not the one most leadership books offer. The drain you feel, she argues, does not come from the work itself or even from difficult circumstances. It comes from drama, the elaborate self-serving stories people tell themselves about their circumstances, and from a leadership philosophy that, however well-meaning, has been feeding that drama for 30 years. What follows is a summary of her argument, presented as she builds it, from a former family therapist who stumbled into a discovery and turned it into a career. Wakeman's claim is bold and quantified. The average employee spends roughly 2.5 hours every workday in what she calls emotional waste, and organizations are bleeding billions because of it. Her remedy is not a new program to layer on top of the old ones. It is a dismantling of the old ones, the engagement surveys, the change management theories, the open-door policies, and a return to something she insists is both simpler and more respectful of human beings: reality. This book is her case that a leader's job is not to make people happy, motivate them, or shield them from hard truths, but to call them to greatness and let reality do the teaching. What makes the argument worth sitting with is that it cuts against the grain of nearly everything corporate culture currently celebrates. Wakeman is asking leaders to stop coddling, stop apologizing for change, and stop treating every opinion as equally valuable. It is, in places, uncomfortable. It is also, on her telling, the only thing that actually works. Chapter 1. Drama and the Data. Wakeman opens with a confession, dressed as a triumph. She once bought a doorstop. Newly promoted and fresh from a human resources boot camp, she had been told that great leaders keep an open door, so she propped hers open and waited for the engaged, motivated team that conventional wisdom promised. What arrived instead was a parade of people who asked for a minute and stayed 45, not to solve problems, but to tattle, vent, and spin doom-laden fantasies about a future that existed only in their heads. The capstone of each visit was the line that finally broke the spell. "Please don't do anything about this. I just wanted you to be aware." That failure sent her looking for data, and the data became the spine of her career. Years earlier, rolling out electronic medical records, she had run a simple time study. 1 column for time physicians spent with patients, 1 for time spent typing notes. Her observers insisted on a 3rd column, and that 3rd column delivered the revelation. Physicians were spending roughly 2 hours a day complaining about the new technology, sometimes to the patients themselves. The tool worked fine. The resistance to it was the leak. Wakeman saw the same pattern in organization after organization until she gave herself a title that fits no business card template: drama researcher. To put numbers to the intuition, her firm partnered with the Futures Company and surveyed 800 leaders across more than 100 organizations. The finding that mattered most was that emotional waste had grown since the 1990s. Leaders now reported nearly 2.5 hours a day lost to it, more than 17 hours a week, over 800 hours a year per person, multiplied across the whole workforce. The sources clustered into a handful of recurring categories, and the most expensive single category was ego itself. Hurt feelings, gossip, defensiveness, the comparison of one's suffering against another's. The deeper problem, Wakeman argues, is that the tools organizations bought to fix this are the tools generating it. Traditional engagement and change management programs feed the ego, tolerate dissent against decisions that were never up for a vote, and pursue engagement without accountability, which, she warns in a phrase she will repeat like a refrain, produces entitlement rather than commitment. We have built whole workplaces on the premise that if leaders can only soften reality enough, people will finally choose to perform. But reality cannot be softened, only met. The takeaway here is quietly subversive. Suffering at work is largely self-imposed, manufactured by the stories we tell rather than by the conditions we face. That is not a counsel of despair. It is the opposite, because a self-imposed burden is one a person actually has the power to set down. Chapter 2. Ego versus Reality. The ego is not your amigo. With that line, Wakeman draws the distinction the whole book turns on. The ego, as she uses the term, is the part of the psyche that narrates experience in the service of self-protection. And it is, by design, an unreliable narrator. It scans the environment for insult, manufactures conspiracy, keeps score of grievances, and insists that one's own suffering is uniquely legitimate. Reality, by contrast, is the friend who gives it to you straight. The highest quality data, she insists, always comes from reality. The ego exists to filter that data out. She is careful to separate ego from confidence, which is a genuine faith in one's abilities. Ego is something else. It operates from self-interest, craves validation, resists feedback, and assigns motives it cannot verify. Her illustration is unforgettable. An employee told her the workplace was toxic and produced, as evidence, an email inviting staff to an ice cream social. The 2 p.m. timing, the woman explained, was a deliberate plot to exclude her busy team. And besides, she was lactose intolerant and no substitutions had been offered. Conspiracy and insult, conjured from free ice cream. That, Wakeman says, is what the ego lives for. The leadership move she recommends is to treat the ego the way one treats a toddler clutching a toy. You do not wrestle it away with logic and reason, you incite a tantrum that way. You offer something more compelling, and the small mind, unable to hold 2 desires at once, releases its grip. For the ego, the more compelling offer is a good question, because people cannot vent and self-reflect at the same time. Venting, she argues against decades of received wisdom, is not healthy. It does not resolve anything. Research shows it deepens negativity rather than dissolving it. Her line lands like a slap. People say venting helps them feel better, and so, she replies, does crack cocaine. The chapter's emotional center is the distinction between sympathy and empathy. Sympathy climbs into the passenger seat of the complaint, agrees that the person is a victim of circumstance, and soothes the ego while feeding the suffering. Empathy acknowledges the difficulty and then separates the suffering from the reality, ending in a call to greatness. Wakeman tells of a year in which her team was asked to move offices 5 times. Her staff was in revolt, and she marched toward the CEO's office full of righteousness, until a mentor stopped her with a single question, asked twice. Not is moving hard, which it plainly was, but why is your team suffering? The light eventually went on. They were not suffering because they were moving. They were suffering because they had refused to grow the skill of being mobile. Reality was not hurting them, their unreadiness was. This is the chapter's enduring gift, and it reaches well past the office. Our circumstances are not the reason we cannot succeed. They are the reality within which we must. Attachment and delusion cause suffering. Reality met honestly does not. Chapter 3. A new role for the leader. If the old role of the leader was to inspire, motivate, direct, and oversee, Wakeman wants to retire most of that job description. People make their own choices about motivation, she argues, which makes keeping them motivated an impossible mandate. And the traditional methods sold to leaders to accomplish it mostly inflame the very ego they are meant to manage. In its place, she proposes a role that is less about managing and making sure, and more about energy management and facilitation, helping people bypass their own egos through good questions, rather than supplying them with answers. The shift is concrete. Instead of participating in meetings as the smartest person solving the problem, the leader becomes the one who turns why we can't into how we can. The mark of success is portable. Employees keep using the better mental processes even when the leader has left the room or left the company entirely. Wakeman frames these interventions as no-ego moments, small, deliberate openings in which a person is helped to notice they have slipped into ego and is coached back toward reality. Much of the chapter is a practitioner's toolkit for creating those moments, and the through line is self-reflection, which she calls the ultimate ego bypass tool and the core driver of accountability. She offers a sequence of internal disciplines. Stop believing everything you think, and notice that you are not your thoughts until you agree with them. Go first, giving others the listening or generosity you feel you are owed. Open your heart and mind by generating kinder explanations for others' behavior and asking how you are contributing. Get back on track by treating your own suspicion as a signal to examine your own motives. She is blunt about the person perpetually threatening to quit in their head. If you are constantly rehearsing your exit, In a sense, you have already left, and you have given yourself a permanent excuse never to be fully accountable. Underneath the tool sits a tool of projection, which Wakeman treats with a therapist's eye. When threatened, the ego looks outward for someone to blame, and the person standing in front of it, the leader delivering the news, is the obvious target. Her counsel is to make thinking visible. Capture the conversation on a whiteboard, move from adversary to facilitator, deliver reality, and then get out of preaching mode. The story she ends on is small and perfect. An employee named Lisa came to her in tears after asking trainees for feedback and receiving a harsh dose of it. While Lisa wept, Wakeman quietly wrote 3 sentences. I asked for feedback. I received feedback. Now I am crying. Are these the facts? She asked. Lisa laughed because they were. Everything else had been the story. The lesson is one a contemplative tradition would recognize instantly. Clarity begins when we stop and ask what we actually know to be true. Stripped of the narration, the restless self keeps layering on top. Chapter 4. Broken Engagement. Let's call the whole thing off. Here Wakeman turns her argument on the sacred cow of modern human resources. Employee engagement. Leaders have been told for decades that keeping employees engaged is their job, and she calls this not merely difficult but impossible because engagement is a choice no leader can make on another's behalf. Worse, the prevailing philosophy rests on 3 assumptions. She considers not just wrong but dangerous, and she spends the chapter dismantling each. The first flawed assumption is that every employee's opinion carries equal weight. Engagement surveys go to everyone and average the results, sending the quiet message that all feedback is equally valuable. But it is not, she argues, because employees do not contribute equally. She draws 2 characters. Deb the driver, who clears every bar set for her and helps others over it too, and Vicky the victim, who wears her victimhood like a beloved bathrobe and treats the company as a conspiracy against her comfort. We differentiate among employees constantly, in hiring, pay, promotion, and firing. So why, she asks, would we pretend their feedback is interchangeable? Her own experiment makes the point vividly. When she split a hospital team by accountability level and asked each group what would improve their workplace, one group asked for free parking, daycare, and catered food, while the other begged for a working printer on the patient care floor because a paper jam kept obscuring blood thinner warnings and might kill someone. She did not need to be told which group was which. The second flawed assumption is that perfecting people's circumstances will produce engagement. Survey questions about whether employees have the right tools or competitive pay, she argues, are invitations to manufacture excuses for withholding commitment. She compares it to an underperforming college student who, asked what he needs to write better papers, produces an ever-expanding list, a new laptop, a bigger food allowance, someone to manage his girlfriend, none of which will actually make him write the paper. His grades will improve when reality, in the form of a professor who refuses late work, stops being softened. Meeting the list only breeds entitlement because there is always one more item on it. The third flawed assumption is that engagement drives results. Wakeman concedes a correlation but denies the causation, and she reaches for a memorable statistical parable. In Northern Europe, rising stork populations once correlated so strongly with rising birth rates that people assumed storks brought babies. The hidden variable was the harvest. Abundant food drew the storks and, separately, produced the well-fed merrymaking that produced the babies. In her analogy, engagement is the stork, and results are the baby. The great harvest that actually drives both is accountability. Engaged employees are genuinely valuable, she insists, but engagement without accountability is the stork without the harvest, and the entitlement it breeds is its own slow leak. The deepest truth here is an old one wearing new clothes. A person's flourishing is bound not to the perfection of their circumstances, but to what they are willing to take responsibility for within them. Chapter 5. The Happy Marriage of Accountability and Engagement. Having spent a chapter taking engagement apart, Wakeman now reassembles it on a sounder foundation. The good news, she says, is that you need not scrap your engagement survey. You need to read it through what she calls an accountability decoder ring. The same data, filtered by who is giving the feedback, tells a radically different and more useful story. She grounds this in real science. Since the 1980s, behavioral research has measured accountability reliably through the concept of locus of control, the distinction between people who attribute their outcomes to external circumstances and those who attribute them to their own choices. Wakeman adapted those validated instruments to the workplace, building a filter tested on more than 200,000 people. Layered onto a traditional survey, it turns down the volume on low accountability complaints and tunes in the voices of the high accountables, the people actually driving results and most likely to identify real organizational barriers rather than personal discomforts. The power of this is best seen in a story she tells of a company whose survey suggested employees did not trust leadership, scores so low they might have sent every leader to remedial training. The filter inverted the picture. Among the highly accountable, trust in leadership was nearly universal and was regarded as a company strength. The distrust came almost entirely from low accountability employees who experienced necessary fast-moving decisions as threats. Without the filter, the company would have spent enormous energy trying to please precisely the people whose egos craved perfect circumstances, and handed those people the power to halt progress the business needed to survive. The chapter's longest case study follows a regional credit union whose reality-based survey returned disappointing scores. Low trust, dissatisfaction with benefits, resentment at not being consulted on decisions. Faced with a choice between chasing engagement and building accountability, leaders chose accountability. Rather than buying affection with richer benefits, they researched and confirmed their package was competitive, then simply educated employees about its real cost and value, and the complaints subsided. Rather than promising "trust us," they grew direct. Decisions would not be made by committee, but they would be clearly explained, and every employee faced two honest options: buy in or make a plan to transition out. There was, pointedly, no third option. Within a couple of years, high accountable employees rose by nearly a quarter. Disengagement fell by half, and the business exceeded its goals 2 years running. The principle she distills is that a workplace, like any community worth belonging to, is strengthened not by indulging its least committed members, but by honoring the obligations of its most committed ones. Chapter 6. Understanding Accountability. Accountability, Wakeman writes, is the ultimate ego bypass, and yet it is among the most misunderstood words in corporate life. Leaders are told to hold people accountable, and the phrase smuggles in an assumption of force, as though accountability were something one person could install in another through policy and enforcement. She rejects this. You cannot hold another person accountable. You can only insist on it and make reality visible, while the individual decides whether to step up. Reality, she argues, is the single most motivating force for accountability, which is why leaders who chronically sugarcoat difficult truths are not being kind. They are enabling and protecting ego. Her favorite illustration involves a physician who flatly refused to comply with a patient outreach initiative and who had no reporting relationship to Wakeman at all. She held no power over him, but she was responsible for reporting compliance to the executive medical staff, and she did so with the data alone. No tattling, no editorializing. His name simply last on the list. Afterward, he wanted to know whether she had explained his heavy patient load, his many committees, his chronic cases. He had expected her, as others had before, to embroider the data with his excuses. She had not. The natural consequence followed without her wielding any authority, and his nurse began making the calls. Delivering reality, undiluted, did the work that power never could. From research with 1,500 people and focus groups of 200 high accountables, Wakeman draws a definition built on 4 factors. Commitment comes first and is non-negotiable. She compares asking for it explicitly to the way flight attendants demand a verbal yes from passengers in the exit row, refusing to assume willingness. Resilience comes second and, crucially, is less about lone stamina than about building networks and reaching out early for the next step, rather than rescue. Ownership comes third, audible in the prolific use of the word I chose, I assumed, and recognizable by the absence of defensiveness, which she treats as a reliable signature of ego. Continuous learning comes fourth and is the one most often neglected, the willingness not merely to own a mistake, but to refuse to repeat it. She then maps 5 phases through which leaders can cultivate accountability: challenge, experienced accountability, feedback, self-reflection, and collegial mentoring. And her emphasis falls hardest on the middle 3. Leaders should resist the urge to protect people from natural consequences, then deliver feedback that is short and factual. Feedback short, self-reflection long, because anything longer hooks the ego's defensiveness. Self-reflection she calls the linchpin, a private and almost meditative state of inquiry that seeks truth from within rather than forcing it from without. And because the ego will go hunting for someone to confirm its story, typically trying 3 times to be talked off the hook, colleagues must learn to hold the space rather than collude, gently turning a wounded co-worker back toward what might be true. There is something almost ascetic in this vision. Growth comes not from comfort, but from honest self-examination undertaken in the company of people willing to tell us the truth in love. Chapter 7. Change Management is so 20th Century. Wakeman opens this chapter by indicting herself. In 1989, she delivered a forward-thinking talk on managing change, and then sat through the next speaker's urgent case for teaching everyone keyboarding skills before desktop computers took over. Both messages felt cutting-edge. Today, one of them is laughable, and her point is that change management has aged exactly as poorly as the keyboarding seminar, yet organizations keep teaching it as though it were fresh. She names the vintage of the theories still circulating: Kurt Lewin's unfreeze move refreeze model from 1948, William Bridges's transition model from 1979, John Kotter's 8-step framework from 1996, all conceived, she notes, in or before a workplace that predated the technologies and pace we now take for granted. These were valuable in their moment, but they were designed to help people cope with discrete, occasional change. The marketplace no longer offers change in that flavor. It comes fast and furious and continuously, and a philosophy built on helping people grieve and recover from it leaves leaders, in her sharp formulation, overmanaging, overcoddling, and underleading. The reframe she offers replaces change management with business readiness. And the difference in orientation is everything. Change management aims to make change least disruptive for employees, while business readiness aims to make change least disruptive to the business. She then demolishes 4 myths in turn. Change is hard. Only, she counters, for the unready. 2 employees handed the same new smartphone will experience it as gift or as ordeal, depending entirely on whether they kept up with the upgrades, and the variable is never the phone. People need time to grieve change, but grief, properly understood, belongs to death and genuine loss, not to new software or a different desk, and borrowing Kubler-Ross's stages of dying to describe a reorganization is a category error that licenses endless emotional waste. We can't handle so much change, a fear-driven plea to make the earthquake stop, when the only real option is to learn to respond to it. And we can control the pace of change, which businesses cannot, because change arrives from outside, indifferent to anyone's comfort. Her measure of an employee's worth captures the whole argument. Current performance plus future potential minus 3 times the emotional expense of their drama. Readiness, not nostalgia, is the asset. The wisdom beneath the management language is genuinely old. Our pain comes not from the changes in our lives, but from our resistance to them, and the person who holds reality with open hands, fluent in the new without being attached to it, is the one who suffers least and serves most. Chapter 8. Business Readiness. If the previous chapter argued for replacing change management with business readiness, this one shows what that replacement looks like in practice. Business readiness, Wakeman insists, is not a gentler cousin of change management, but a different species. It requires leaders to deliver reality constantly, with transparency and clear expectations and without apology, while directing people's energy toward great results, no matter what the new reality demands. Transparency is its keystone. Here is what we know today. Here is where you come in. How can you help? A posture that moves people from passivity toward accountable action. She organizes the work as a pyramid of 5 ascending states, and the leader's task at each level is to ask the question that moves a person upward. Awareness comes first, but she warns it cannot be the resting place. And her funniest evidence is the company whose employees complained endlessly that they did not understand the strategy. A strategy posted at eye level on the inside of the bathroom door, impossible to miss. The information was everywhere. The resistance was the refusal to consume it. Willingness comes next, and here she presses leaders to make it conscious and visible by asking directly, on a scale of 1 to 10, what a person's commitment is, and following any low number with, "What is your plan to get more willing?" She confesses her own failure to do this, negotiating with a reluctant son on a dock while his ready, willing, wetsuited brothers roasted in the sun on the boat, to make the point that coaxing the unwilling punishes the committed. Advocacy is the third level, and it is about integrity. The person who pledges support privately but stays silent while resistors dominate the room has not really committed. Rather than silencing a vocal minority, she counsels activating the silent majority, coaching those who privately agree to speak up early and often, as one high-tech company did to reclaim an online forum that a handful of naysayers had captured. Active participation is the fourth level, where employees stop waiting to be told and begin incorporating the new reality into daily work. Her example is a director named Shelley who met a sidelined employee's accusation of favoritism, not with defensiveness, but with a question, "What is stopping you from raising your hand?" and watched him recognize that opportunities are claimed, not handed out. At the summit are drivers, the employees who scan the horizon and become the organization's internal disruptors, though Wakeman cautions against handing the keys to people who fancy themselves visionaries but have not logged the hours or earned the trust. Her closing case is the Nebraska Medical Center, whose team, years before it became necessary, chose to build the country's largest biocontainment unit because they were looking for what was next. When Ebola arrived, they were ready. They saved lives, averted a national contagion, and afterward became partners to the federal government in preparing others. Readiness, cultivated in advance and grounded in reality rather than fear, is what allowed them to meet a genuine crisis with competence instead of panic. There is a quiet moral realism in the example. The future belongs not to those who demand the world hold still, but to those who prepare, in humility, to meet what is actually coming. Chapter 9. Buy-in. Wakeman's final argument takes aim at a word leaders utter constantly and, she contends, misunderstand entirely: buy-in. How do we get buy-in? Do we have it? What will it take? Every such conversation, she writes, is the sound of emotional waste circling the drain. Telling leaders that securing buy-in is their responsibility hands them an impossible burden and, just as damaging, casts the employee in a passive role, free to withhold cooperation until properly courted. Leaders who chase buy-in this way allow change-resistant people to hold the whole organization hostage. Buy-in, she insists, is not an upgrade to be purchased like leather car seats. It is a condition of employment and a core responsibility. The basic way a professional is supposed to show up. No amount of money can buy it, and every attempt to do so indulges the ego, builds entitlement, and reinforces the victim mindset. The leader's real job is not to manufacture buy-in, but to find the willing and work with them, and to be direct with everyone else. On a scale of 1 to 10, what is your level of buy-in? And if it is low, what is your plan to get there? If buy-in genuinely is not on offer, the question turns with startling clarity toward a plan to transition off the team. There is no third option that permits a person to stay and sabotage, or stay and seethe. The chapter's central distinction is between preference and potential. Organizations are not democracies, Wakeman reminds us. The real decision-makers are customers, competitors, regulators, and the evidence. The personal preferences of employees have little bearing on what makes a company competitive, and when someone threatens to veto a change because I don't like it, or I prefer the old way, that is ego choosing preference over potential. She asks resistant people what their signing authority is, perhaps $1,000, and points out that their preference may be costing the organization millions, far beyond their authority to spend. Her small parables drive it home. A cafeteria that lets people toast their own bread and is met with mutiny, though everyone possesses toast-making skills. A salesman named Ed whose decade of results earned him an exemption from new software, so the whole company forfeited the system's potential to purchase the love of one man. Against all this, she sets the value of yes, not the yes of a pushover signing up for all the work, but the yes that commits to a goal and then crowdsources the how. She models it with a son who wanted a ride to a play. She said yes to the goal and no to driving, and let him discover that a friend's mother was happy to help. Those who say yes quickly, backed by expertise and a positive network, are the ones who give birth to innovation. Underneath the business case lies a teaching about the maturity of the soul. The ego loves to keep all its conditions open as a hedge against ever being wrong, while genuine commitment means taking the cards you are dealt and placing your bet, staying in joy or going in peace, but never staying to poison the well. Closing. Taken whole, no ego is less a management manual than an argument about human nature wearing a business suit. Wakeman's organizing insight that our suffering arises not from reality, but from the stories we construct about it, and that maturity means learning to stop believing everything we think, is one the world's contemplative traditions have taught for millennia. Here recovered and pressed into the service of the workplace. Her leader is not a motivator or a rescuer, but something closer to a spiritual director with a whiteboard, someone who refuses to collude with another's self-deception, who delivers reality without cruelty and without apology, and who keeps making the same patient call to greatness. Reality is rough, she writes in the end, and leadership is love, and the two are not opposites but partners, because the most loving thing one can do for another person is decline to lie to them about what is real. What the reader carries forward is a kind of liberation dressed as discipline. If circumstances are not the cause of our failure, but the ground on which we must succeed, then the power to flourish was never held hostage by a bad boss, an inconvenient change, or an imperfect environment. It was ours all along, waiting on the choice to take ownership. That is a demanding gospel, and Wakeman does not pretend otherwise. She admits she screws it up daily and counsels forgiveness, of others and of oneself, early and often. But it is also a hopeful one, rooted in the conviction that human potential is limitless, and that work, freed from the dead weight of drama, can become less effortful and genuinely more joyful. This summary can only trace the shape of her case. The stories, the tools, and the bracing candor that make it land are best met on the page. Read No Ego in full. It is short, it is sharp, and it may change the way you listen to the voice in your own head.